So to the other end of the world. It's always difficult to pinpoint exactly where a journey began. And in my case, the journey I would like to tell you about began with gardens. So imagine traveling through this landscape. It's mountainous, it's cold, it's barren. There's not a whole lot of color. And arriving in a valley that looks like this, in a garden that is sheltered and wild, also still wild, colorful, where apricot trees are grown just beside rocks the size of a house, so that they benefit from the warmth that is stored in the rock during the day and radiated at night, so that even at 9,000 feet of elevation, the apricots ripen in summer. You also get where the apricot soup comes from now. The reason I remember this particular garden very well is that while walking through it for the first time, I heard music play. And it was a symphony by Beethoven, which seemed spectacularly out of place. So inside the house, the farmer told me that, in fairly good French, that he used to be a conductor when he lived in Moscow during the times of the Soviet Union. Now, I saw many gardens after this and met many farmers. And what continued to draw me to them was this combination of something very local and small and colorful and traditional and sheltered, and something open to the world and intelligent, almost cosmopolitan. I always thought of this thing that people say, that a garden is like a mirror of the mind that created it. And this map will explain part of where that comes from. So we're in Central Asia, in a place called the Pamir Mountains of Afghanistan and Tajikistan. And I know there's Tahmina in this room. She says, she just introduced me to me, saying that she was the only Afghan lady living in Sarasota, so I'm very glad you're here. Now, it's a very remote place. Even today, it takes about a week-long walk to get to the furthest villages. People have historically come here to escape persecution. But it is also, these valleys have also been part of the ancient Silk Road. Marco Polo traveled through here, wrote about it. So there have always been outside influences. I would like to tell you a bit about life on both sides of this river that you see, that is nowadays the border between Afghanistan and Tajikistan. Let me check, because I'm very nervous. You see, this morning a friend of mine called me and said, he gave me the usual advice: imagine your audience naked, right? But there's way too many of you, and it's a very distracting thought, so I won't go there. So when I first came here in the winter of 2008, I was there to do research into agricultural crops. You have to know there's about 150 varieties of wheat grown in these mountains, 300 varieties of apricots, even more apples. But at that time, it was a time that some of these outside influences that had always been there through the international trade routes were becoming much stronger. There was, the innovation of a market economy, the international trade. This only happened in the past 15 years. And the development agencies trying to push their vision of progress. So the changes they were causing weren't gradual anymore, as they had been in the past. They were actually massive. And the first time I really felt this was in this beautiful valley, where people explained to me the importance of water. So the Pamir Mountains are dry, like a desert in some places. So people depend on the glaciers and the channels they constructed to guide the water to their fields for agriculture. If the glaciers are gone, if the channels don't get maintained, they don't have water, they don't have agriculture, there's no way of surviving these harsh environments. So every year in spring, they go into the mountains to repair the channels, and there's one family with a very special task. They go up on the hill above the village, and they call the water angels, the guardian angels. So on the top of their voice, they shout, "Oh, Bibi Machro! Oh, Bibi Zainab!" Wait for the angels to come. And I asked them, "Do you still do this?" And they said, "Yes." But we don't shout as loudly anymore. It's more of a whisper now. And I asked them why. I said, well, we're not sure the angels are still here. And it made me sad. You know, I can't see angels, I don't know what they look like, but I wanted them to have theirs. I felt that with the angels, other important things would go too. You know, their agricultural traditions, their seeds, the seeds that I was there to research. So in the years that came, I muddled on. I did my research. You know, I listed the varieties, but always accompanied by this sense of impending loss, but not knowing what to do about it. I knew that seeds were important to this culture, but and safeguarding those seeds was important, but it also wasn't the whole answer. And I started to really doubt my role as a scientist and the role of science more generally in helping to safeguard some of this culture. You know, I'd seen scholars come to the Pamirs, and like me, they listed things, they described things. They took things that were vibrant and alive and put it into dead frameworks and books that no one in the Pamirs would ever see again. And I quit my job. But here we are, 7 years later, and I wrote a book too. And at this point, I would like to introduce this lady to you because she's my co-author and friend, Jamila Haider, and I feel very uncomfortable talking about this book, you know, when she's not here, because it's really because of her that this book was made. I'll use this chair for once, you know. Just wanted to introduce her. Now, this book is, of course, it's very heavy. You know, the favorite thing radio presenters like to do is to drop it on the table right next to the microphone to show their audience how heavy it is. And its weight perhaps suggests that, you know, there's many answers in there and many theories and frameworks, but I like to think it's different, and I'll tell you why. I'll just put it here. Whoops. Again, I think the idea of this book started with a garden, or rather a field, in this valley. It was a field I didn't understand very well. Because for a Western-trained mind, we're used to looking seeing straight lines in field. There's not a whole lot here that makes sense. There's crops, different kinds of crops, different grains and pulses that are grown together in no apparent order. There's chaos. I mean, what do they do when they harvest it? How do they separate these different crops? What do they do with them? And it took me 2 years to find out. And I found out by accident. Now, you have to realize that when you travel through the Pamirs, the food you get is not particularly great. You may wonder why I wrote a cookbook that's about this thick about it, but at one point I asked my colleagues, why do you have hundreds of different varieties of grains? Why do you have so many different kinds of crops if you don't use them in your kitchen? And they smiled at me and said, well, we do. We just don't make that kind of food for foreigners because our food is not prestigious. But the next day they came to me, big smiles, with a whole range of foods that I had never seen before. And one of these was osh, a soup made with noodles. And when I asked them where they got those noodles, they pointed at that field that I just showed. And they explained to me that the different crops that you see there, the different kinds of pulses, beans, peas, and rye, and barley, they're actually chosen precisely so that they ripen at the same time. They're harvested at the same time. They're not separated. They're let to dry in the field, and they're milled in the mill at the same time into this flour, which they call khazorza, mix of 1,000. And so by asking them about food, I understood how incredibly intelligent this field really was, not just because the flour it produced is very nutritious and rich in protein and energy, but also because in these very poor mountain soils, it makes a whole lot of sense to grow grains, which actually require quite a bit from the soils, together with pulses, which fertilize the soil. But it wasn't just the connection between food and agriculture that I understood by asking. By talking about food and making food together, people understood that those connections went much, much, much further. And bread is a good example. So bread is a very simple food, right? But to the Pamirs, it's one of the most sacred. When a child plays around, fools around with bread, they tell him he turns into a monkey, even though there's no monkeys in the Pamirs. You don't step over bread, you don't put it upside down, you respect bread. And so I would just like to show you how bread is connected to the different parts of life. Because bread is wheat specifically is very closely associated to the myth of origin of the Pamiris. Every New Year, their Navruz in March, they make these prints of wheat flour on the ceilings of their house to chase away the bad energy, the bad spirits. The act of threshing the wheat, it's done as a community thing. Some communities only own one pair of oxen, so it has to be done together. It's also the place where at night people go dance to take over the work from the oxen. They dance. That's where you find your girl or your boy or whatever you're looking for. It's really something that keeps a community together. The technologies, the water run mill, is something that is run by a community. And it is, even though the technology to us seems very simple, it is actually really advanced. The water that drives these mills is ice and ice cold. It comes from the mountains, so it keeps the millstones very cold. So when it mills the grains, it keeps all the nutrients. It doesn't burn them. Even something as simple as a storage house, which this one has been there for 200 years, is designed so that the mice can't get in, and the snow, when it melts, doesn't get in either. This lady is weaving a shaparak, which is a mat to hold the dough before it's being put in the oven, because, of course, the dough cannot touch the ground. It's sacred. It has to remain clean. So what I'm trying to show you, if this one helps, right, is that these different elements of life, they're really connected to each other, and they're connected to each other through food. So they feed each other. And every day, people, Pamiris, in their daily life, they live these connections. And to me, that's really what it means to have a living culture. No? And this made me understand the unease that I had felt with my own work and the work that development organizations in the region were doing. Because we treated agriculture as a source of income. We treated hospitality and seeds as commodities. We treated culture as something that should be preserved in a museum. But, we're compartmentalizing something that really should not be compartmentalized. So imagine what happens to hospitality when people are told that they should charge money to their guests. Imagine what happens when the seeds of our grandparents are displaced by seeds from a laboratory in the Netherlands or the United States. Imagine what happens when the recipe for a bread disappears because people are told they can buy it in the market, or, as we earlier saw, when it becomes available in the size of a grape. What happens is that these connections between the different parts of life, between the field, between the landscape, between the people, they become weaker, they disappear. Effectively, you're destroying a culture. And knowledge is destroyed too. Because if we think about it, where does knowledge reside? Is it just something that's in our head, or is it also something that's in the plants that we use and in the hands that touch those plants? When a plant disappears and when the name of a plant is forgotten, we often actually lose the knowledge about that plant. The same thing, when an old person dies, their knowledge often dies with them, especially in a culture like in the Pamirs, which does not have a written tradition. Yeah. So one day, Jamila and I were sitting with this grandmother asking her about her recipes, and we were writing them down. And as she was talking, her family gathered around us. More and more people from the community joined us. Wait, this is going much too fast. swapping a few things. But so more and more people gathered around us, and at some point she grabbed me and she said, "Look, you see how important this is? You please write this down, make it into a booklet, bring it back to me, I'll pay you for it." And we said yes, thinking about a 30-page booklet and 3 months of our lives, and then we'd get on with life again. But just as what happened with the bread and the osh soup that I showed, every recipe had a story around it. And 3 months and 30 pages weren't nearly enough to write all of that down. And in the vein of this conference, I probably ought to tell you that it was all inspiration and creativity that got us to that point. But the truth is, really, I'm as lost as anybody. I'm really quite lost, and I'm very insecure. It was terrifying, the thought that real people would read the words that we had written. Just as it's quite terrifying to be standing here today. But about a month, or last month, when Leonard Cohen died, I remember reading in his obituary, it said, it was something he said, it's like, "Everything is important. The absence of the casual has always attracted to me." And I think that was probably what did attract me, or it did inspire me and us in the Pamirs, is that by talking about food, we could see how these many things of life, the landscape, the gestures of the people, the seeds, the celebrations, even the shy laugh of a woman who would cook us something that was too humble, she felt, how all these things are connected. Food had been the lens that has showed us how important, how strong and beautiful this culture was. And I think we both wished we had the roar of a lion to tell these organizations how important it was to safeguard that culture and to stop doing the things that unraveled it. But organizations aren't made to deal with complex ideas, and some of them actually retracted their funding for this book when they realized it wasn't just about food anymore. It didn't fit that particular box in their structure of the world. So, faced with that much bureaucratic power, our voices weren't much more than a squeak of a mouse, and neither, we realized, were the voices of all those people who had told us their stories. So what did keep us going eventually, and I hope this will listen to me now, what did keep us going is that the idea, the vision that if we could bundle all those voices, hundreds of voices, and bring them back to the Pamiris in a written form, that their voices might not be ignored anymore. So I want to leave you with a few images of when we did go back with a truck full of books, one for each community in this region, and it'll show you some more of this culture. So please run the film.
Ой, это мой дядя.
Там живут, да?
Да.
Это книга местных блюд традиционных Памире.
Спасибо. Я не против. Большое спасибо.
پامیر همچون آهنگ دست جمعی تضاداست که مردم پامیر به آن آوردن. مینت وزنی و جشنواره، درد و خنده، تولد و مرگ، سفر و بازگشت، خردترین دانه و آسمان بیکنار. ما سمت آب را به زمین پر از سنگ روانه کرده آن را به خاک زندگی بخش مبادل می سازیم.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحیم. یا حضرت بابا دقون از یک جانند هزارم بیشمار.
Bir maşoş seyahat Allah koydu. Focus marizin das beine jest.
ماشانانوت سابق اکدتی در هر کارم شریک
به حرمت خاندان طیبین طاهرین به رحمت یا ارحم الراحمین.
Omdat het leven moeilijk is hier, omarmt men de vooruitgang. En ik denk dat soms niet helemaal duidelijk is wat er verloren gaat.